Welcome in to another episode of the RotoViz Best Ball Show. I'm Kevin Szafraniec, and today I'm joined by Colm Kelly. Today we're going to be talking some late round values and best ball contests. Colm, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm excited to jump into some of these names and see where we can find some values as we move forward here into the heart. It's hard to believe it's the 18th of March, but we're in the heart of draft season almost.
Yeah, this past weekend, Ross Durham and I entered a FFPC Superflex contest. That draft is up now, and anybody that enjoyed that is interested in jumping into FFPC, especially people who are not used to playing at the FFPC. There is a code 25 RotoViz available to new users who get $25 off their first team. And I mean, I just got to say, FFPC really is my favorite platform to play on. I mean, between full PPR, tight end premium, Colm can attest to this too. It's a little more widespreadly available for people outside of the U.S. Compared to some other platforms. And just in general, it's just a one-stop shop between dynasty, best ball, season long, high stakes. I mean, there's price points all across the board. So just overall, it's a great platform to play on. And I say with code 25 RotoViz, 25 RoToViz, you get $25 off your first team there. So it's best ball season, everything's picking up, and we're going to be talking a little more FFPC today.
Yeah, I think, and just for me to jump in, I've been playing the FFPC for years and years, but it is an interesting time of the off season where, if you are consuming content like this, the one thing people might have a little bit of hesitation at this point of the year is like, well, everyone that's drafting is going to be like really involved in the weeds of it, but it's a great way to hone your skills as well, drafting at this point of the year, because I often talk about then when you get, as you move forward through draft season, you're sharpening your tools as you work through those draft things. When you mentioned some of the options, and I play Dynasty over there, play best ball over there, would recommend it. And the other thing I will mention as we kick off here, myself and Kevin are hoping to do some drafts against some of the listeners over the next couple of months over on the FFPC. I have had some people reach out that are interested in joining us on one of these drafts. So if you are interested in playing against us, and maybe you're a seasoned player over at the FFPC, or maybe you're thinking about signing up with that promo code, let us know at rotovizradio@gmail.com. We'll try and get one of those set up over the coming weeks. Usually, I try and set them up, maybe start talking about it a month before we set it up, but we will try and get some of those going over the course of the next couple of months. But Kevin, let's get to the meat of the action. What are we looking at here? What is the goal of today's show?
Well, someone viewer sent a listener question in to Colm. Basically said, "Hey Colm, haven't picked your brain in a while. Been doing a decent number of never too early superflex tourney drafts, and I've run into this dilemma several times. Last round or two, running backs have really dried up. More often than not, I am tacking an additional wide receiver. Do you see any value in vets like Gabe Davis or Deontay Johnson there? They're basically free. I like a few of the rookie wide receivers there, like A.O. Maynor, Betch, Bond, Savion Williams, but usually I already have several rookies, and I feel inclined to grab a vet who could overperform. Any thoughts?" So just once Colin sent that over to me, just kind of figured, why just stick with wide receivers? We could just go through kind of all the ADPs of the last couple rounds in the super flex, never too early best ball draft, and kind of pick out our favorite players, kind of talk through some players there that may be traps or maybe, huge values. So I figured we would kick it off with the wide receivers, because that's kind of where the question was kind of leading, talking about, I mean, by name, it was Deontay Johnson and Gabe Davis. I mean, personally, those are not my guys that I'm necessarily looking at, but that doesn't mean that there are not any values there. Specifically, I mean, one of the guys that, he mentions Gabe Davis, but I think, Diami Brown is really one of my favorite. I mean, somebody that's on the Jaguars now. He's one of the guys that I'm really looking at. I've been kind of hammering in drafts. But do you have any targets that you're specifically looking for in the last couple rounds?
So to go into the two that you mentioned Davis there. Like, I always thought there's upside with him. We've seen spike week performances from him over the course of his career. But the one thing I'd be looking at is, like, sometimes you say, like, well, that player could be better in best ball. Like somebody who always fitted that in early best ball streets was Deshaun Jackson. It was always like, you're going to get the weeks, but then there might be nothing. Even somebody like this is even further down the line, the likes of like Ted Ginn and things like that. You're going to get some of these deep shots and maybe get some points. But when we look at Gabe Davis, he certainly has big weeks. But if we look back through to the start of the 2022 season, he's in week 5 a 32.1 point game. That's the highest he has had over the course of the last 3 seasons. The next highest game is 23.7. There's a couple of games between 21 and 23 in there. But if we look at like the numbers, he's 17% as a wide receiver 1, 12% wide receiver 2, 71% of the time as a wide receiver 3 or worse. And he's only an active 7% of those games. So like that's basically last season, but there's multiple zeros in there. And if we're even looking at best ball, like we have 2 years ago, it was kind of a famous stretch where he had a 23-point game followed by a 0-point game. Then he had another 0-point game 2 weeks later, followed by a 22-point game. Then he had 2 0-point games back to back, followed by a 23-point game. Fair enough if you want to take a shot on him for best ball. I just think the inconsistency over the course of his career is not something that I want to be buying into even at this point of the draft. And then Deontay Johnson, I was joking with you before we started recording. If you look over like the course of the last 12 months, it felt like he might be somebody who in free agency would be getting, a substantial contract. People might be interested in moving forward, but it just all has kind of fallen apart from him over the course of the last 12 months. But if we even look up as far as week 6 last season, he had 19.8 points in that game. He had 23.3 in week 4. He had 26.1 in week 3. Started off the season really pretty strong. The problem was the games outside of those were all less than 6 points, or the 4 games around those opening 7 weeks of the season. But I would say if I was looking at the 2 of them, I have a lot more hope that you would see something in, Johnson, and that's me saying short term. But if I go back and look at Johnson through 2022, he has only been a wide receiver 1 12% of the time, wide receiver 2 17% of the time, 71% a wide receiver 3 or worse. I think these guys are much more like name value players than what they actually deliver. So basically you're looking at 3 years of not consistently delivering for Johnson and almost a career so far for Gabe Davis of not consistently delivering. So obviously you're in the late rounds and you're like, veteran I've seen do something in the past, but I think at that point of the draft you're much better to be going for a player who could be on the ascendant. It's very unlikely that those players re-hit. Now we are going to talk a little bit about some 5th-year breakout players, so it's kind of like, the veterans won't ever get it back, but these guys who never had it might end up turning out good. But what I would say is I think we're at the tail end, the back end of both those players. And I think even you mentioned like De'Ami Brown now being with the Jaguars. I think we'll see De'Ami Brown, even with not having done a huge amount in his career, surpass Gabe Davis this season in terms of pretty early what the Jaguars are thinking for this offense between those 2 guys. So I'm quite excited about him as well, even though he's entering his 5th year. Down the end, I was almost hoping that maybe he did hang around in Washington, because if they had Debo now, and then you have the situation that they had Terry McLaurin, if he's the wide receiver 3 with those 2 and he's starting to come on with Jaden Daniels, I think that would have been a pretty fun spot for him. But I think now that we have him with Jacksonville, Brian Robinson Jr. there, I think he's an interesting piece at this point where he could ascend. Another player who, it's not the most exciting name in the world, and there is likely to be wide receivers that do come in on top of him in the NFL draft, but Demario Douglas, somebody again not extremely exciting, but I think so far free agency has gone pretty well for him in terms of not facing a huge amount of competition moving forward. So he's in this zone. And if I was looking at the players that I think that could be interesting, he would fit that. Now, if we do look at the numbers he did have last year, they're all, we're all about wide receiver 3s, 94% of the time a wide receiver 3, but he was still being phased into the offense, would be the phrase I would use. But there's not a huge amount from the veteran wide receiver crew here to be very excited about. Dammy Brown would be the pick of them for me as well. And you're looking then at the fifth-year breakout. The other breakouts, Joshua Palmer, Tutu Atwell, Elijah Moore. Always had hopes for Elijah Moore, but it's getting a little bit trickier. But he would be probably the second in this list for me. Looking through those names, is there any that are jumping out at you? Like AD Mitchell is there? If there's a situation where the QB shifts away from Anthony Richardson during the season, is there anything that we could see from him? It's hard to know based on what we've seen in his rookie season, but veteran wide receivers, I think, is not the place to be targeting players here at this point. I want to have my wide receivers through those opening 7 to 9 rounds of the draft, and at this point be feathering in potentially some of the rookies, but we'll talk a little bit here about the tight ends, but especially rookie running backs at this point are where I would be putting a lot of my faith.
Yeah, AD Mitchell, he's one of the names that popped down there that could see an uptick in production, but it's rough. I just, after Derek Stingley just got a big pay raise from Houston, there was a cut up of AD Mitchell playing the Texans last year and kind of like roasting Stingley's that I saw, or roasting Stingley and Richardson just missing him over and over wide open down the field. Yeah. So it kind of reminded me of that. But you also did mention the fifth-year breakouts, and going back to Sean's great work on fifth-year breakouts years ago, really the three biggest factors that we have to think about are obviously a player going into his fifth year, changing teams, being drafted outside the top 50. Like really, those are the three things that to look for wide receiver breakouts. And really, Diami Brown and Josh Palmer are the two that really that kind of check all three boxes. So those are the two that, even though Josh Palmer isn't somebody I'm super excited to draft, especially if I do by chance, pay up or get Josh Allen, especially in a super flex, he's somebody I'd be looking to add to that kind of fits the criteria, the question of more looking for veterans. So those are the two really. I mean, Elijah Moore hasn't found a new home yet, but he was also, at the top of the second round, so he doesn't really fit the box or check the box of being outside the top 50. But even, of those, you mentioned Tutu as well, who's, staying in Los Angeles. But even of all four of those guys, Diami Brown was drafted the latest at pick 82. So it's not like they were fifth, sixth round picks. I mean, they still had the talent to be drafted in the top 3 rounds. And even when I was putting together a lot of the wide receiver advanced stats wrap up at the end of the year, I mean, Diami Brown popped in pretty much like all the yards after catch and evasion, the metrics. So he's somebody that, that hasn't popped yet, but I mean, he had the talent to get drafted early. He's shown with the opportunities, especially, coming on late. So he's somebody that I'm getting the most excited about. I'm drafting him quite a bit, but my exposure to him's getting pretty hefty. So of those players, of the veterans, those are the guys I'd be looking at. But at the same time, even with some rookie wide receivers on my rosters, I'd still be looking to hammer some of the, a few more of the rookie wide receivers at the end of the draft. Because when you look into, players with ADPs in the last few rounds, we're looking at Xavier Restrepo, Jack Betch, Isaiah Bond, Jalen Royals, Torrey Horton, and Ty Felton. And especially those last 3 are the 3 that I'm really excited to draft. I think they have a lot of potential. And I was just kind of wondering, I mean, the this year's rookie wide receiver class is a little maligned. I was wondering kind of how you're feeling about some of those late round guys, if there's people you're targeting, or are you just maybe trying to stay away a little bit and focus more on veterans?
I think when I'm on the clock, if I had to take wide receiver at this point of the draft, I would take all 6 of those rookies ahead of all of the veterans that we've talked about today. And part of that is like they may be nothing, but the likelihood with a lot of these veterans we've talked about is they will be like, they are nothing already in terms of a fantasy asset. Like just that thing of like, you get a landing spot, you get an opportunity, and they could move up that depth chart ahead of these guys. And I think you mentioned Royals. I think he's very, very interesting. Horton and Felton as well. But just to have, the potential upside of like this hidden package that you're not truly sure what it is. Like one of the things that I find interesting is we talk through all the names. I'm pulling them up here in the Stat Explorer, and I'm like, wide receiver 3, 93% of the time, wide receiver 3, 94% of the time. Every one of them was basically over 90% of the time was a wide receiver 3 or worse. I had to go back to the start of his career, but De'Ami Brown, who we're both the most excited about, had one wide receiver 1 game over the course of his career, 98% wide receiver 3. So, like, again, we're at the end of drafts and we have to filter this with expectations, and we're painting in the lines as to what could happen. Like I mentioned Douglas, and I was like, well, it was over 90% wide receiver 3, but a lot of his games are in that 10 to 12 point range last season, where, like, it's almost usable, but if he got a little bit more work, it becomes very usable. If Drake May takes that step forward in the offense this year, it becomes even better. So you're kind of trying to pick, like, these players are going to be they're at the end of the draft for a reason. So you're trying to see what's in between the lines in terms of the trajectory. And the trajectory of a lot of the veterans, even with optimism, is not all that positive. So the rookies, I think, coming in are going to be given a shot in year one and to see how they develop moving forward. But we are going to move on to the other positions, and I think that that's where we start to, the way we're going to build out our rosters, we're likely sliding them and then at the end of drafts here.
Yeah, especially, I mean, moving from rookie wide receivers to rookie running backs. I mean, the question that was submitted basically said the running backs have dried up, but I mean, especially if you go and look through the rookie guide this year, or you pretty much listen to any pod that we're putting out there. I mean, this rookie running back class is stacked, and I don't think that these late round ADPs are really representative of the talents that these guys have. I think they're more getting pushed down just for the fact of the sheer amount of good prospects there are in this rookie class. So you're talking about guys like Trevor Etienne, Brashard Smith, Raheem Sanders, LaQuinn Allen Jr., Jaden Blue, Jarquez Hunter, and Taj Brooks. And of those 7 players, the 4 that I'm really, really interested in snatching up at the end of drafts are Etienne, Raheem Sanders, Jarquez Hunter, and Taj Brooks. I mean, looking at veteran, I mean, they're all pretty young guys, but the veteran running backs that are available in the same area are like Kendre Miller, Marshawn Lloyd, Will Shipley, Audric Estime, Sean Tucker. And I mean, I would take pretty much any of those rookies over those veterans at this point. Are you kind of following a similar draft strategy?
Very, very similar, yeah. We're going to be aligned here on a lot of stuff, I think, Kevin. What I would say is, I thought what you were going to say was you would take any of those running backs over any of those wide receivers. I would definitely the veteran wide receivers. I would be taking, like, again, I've mentioned this a few times, that would be the direction that I would be rathering to go at this particular point. We did a draft a couple of weeks ago, Kevin, where it was just all rookies. I think we were at 50% rookies for the whole draft. There was a lot of rookie running backs in that draft. But you mentioned the depth. I think part of the reason, too, that at this point of the draft season, they're at this range of ADP is people, we're not sure of the landing spot. Do they go, day 2 late? Do they go day 3? Are they undrafted? All that plays a factor. Like, if one of these guys ended up, being a UDFA, like, all of a sudden, like, they're undraftable. It's that kind of situation. Whereas the thing is if they get drafted in the 4th round, all of a sudden, they're multiple rounds ahead of where they are now. If it's an exciting landing spot where they have an opportunity to climb that depth chart. So the rookie running backs, very interesting. I think, though, this veteran class of running backs is interesting. Now, when we mentioned Kendre Miller, people probably will roll their eyes. We've talked about him for multiple years, and it obviously didn't work out so far. I think Lloyd, for the Packers is interesting. It's behind Josh Jacobs. I was hoping that it would be a situation last season that he would challenge Josh Jacobs as the season went on. Jacobs outperformed any of my expectations for the year. Marshawn Lloyd obviously lost the majority of the season through injury, featured in one game, in week 2. But the problem for him was got injured in preseason, then got injured in the season. He was then about to come back from his injury, and he had appendicitis, I believe. At that point, he had his appendix removed, missed the rest of the season. So just a disastrous rookie campaign for him. Now, we're talking about veterans, and if some of these running backs land in on top of the veterans, what that means. But if the Packers were to, it would obviously show what they think of Marshawn Lloyd moving forward if they don't draft a running back. But if they do draft, let's say, one of these guys, like a Trevor Etienne, like, Marshawn Lloyd is pretty crushed at that particular point in terms of him moving forward. I liked him coming in last year, and I'm still interested to see what he could do this season. The other one that I really liked last year was Will Shipley. he obviously a bit like these were like two bets last year I had on like against the veteran coming in. Let's say that neither of them worked out. Saquon Barkley had an all-timer season, goes on to win the Super Bowl, so it gets a big contract in the offseason. So all that doesn't bode that well for Will Shipley. But again, when we're looking at ADPs and where players are going, the gap in ADP and where the contingent value would be if something did happen to Barkley or he missed some games, Will Shipley would step in. And again, like I mentioned with Lloyd, my concern with the likes of Shipley, Lloyd, even Estime, is if that team drafts a running back, it obviously shows that the team maybe thinks that running back is better than what they have on the roster. And in this position, the backup running back, and it also is going to affect their opportunity to be an impact player, basically moving forward. So there's a couple of things that if these players can get through the draft without somebody being landed in beside them or on top of them would be a massive advantage. Sean Tucker had his massive game last year. I believe it was 44 points, but yeah, I just think, Irving has, tracked so far ahead. He's the RB1. And I think they may even, again, that's a situation if they add in another running back just to have the depth, he becomes completely phased out at that point. So we're just keeping an eye. But Estime with Javonte Williams moving, maybe that shows that there is some, we're talking up on our previous show, Evan Ingram with the Broncos and what that means for Bo Nix. But Bo Nix is a player obviously drafted by Sean Payton. Now they've taken in the tight end that they want. Maybe they have some faith in Estime, and if he gets through this process unscathed, obviously he would be a good value at that point. So there's a lot of, and this is the course of, if you listen to our podcast over the years, I think there's a lot more interesting options in the last couple of rounds at running back than there is at wide receiver, which tends to be consistently the case. Now, could be people can say back to me, Colm, last year you said that too, and Will Shipley did nothing all season, and Kendry Miller did nothing, and that's all fair. But then if you look at the last two rounds of ADP, there's going to be a lot of these guys who fail, but there's going to be some names in there who are absolute rocket fuel for your roster. So it's important to work your way through them. But I still think I'm taking the rookies over these guys. But I think that Shipley and Estime, along with Lloyd, are interesting now, but become extremely interesting, and probably their ADPs obviously shift up if they have a good draft for them.
Yeah, I mentioned to Ross when we were recording this past weekend that I think Lloyd is like the poster boy for my bad zero RB choices last year. And I feel like kind of
did you not see it coming though, that he would get interested and injured in preseason, and then by the time of the end of the season he would have appendix removed? You didn't pencil that in for your projections.
No. But I think I'm taking it out on him. Where I'm in on Shipley still, but Lloyd, I don't think I've drafted once all off season. So I'm glad to hear you.
I think you should be more in on Lloyd than Shipley, and the reason I would say for that is Lloyd couldn't play. Shipley was only given the opportunity when the games were completely done. But then when the games were done, we did see some big plays from him as well. Mm-hmm. So you have to give him the credit for that, but it's hard to take credit away from Lloyd other than, if he missed that rookie season and it's affected his development, and the team has moved beyond him. That would be the concern.
Yeah, and a lot of those players too. The way how he said that a lot of the good rookies this year are getting pushed down just because of how many. Like last year's running back was really weak, so I think that maybe like a few of those players, especially like Lloyd, if he was in this year's class, he probably would have been like a mid to late day 3 pick, as opposed to I think he was a late day 2 pick in last year's draft. There was another. We're just moving over to tight end. There's another Green Bay Packer that I'm interested to get some sort of clarity on. Luke Musgrave. Are we holding out any hope that he can be a viable member of that offense? And I asked the Packers fan just because I honestly don't know.
The trouble here, like if you asked me going into last season, I thought Luke Musgrave was the tight end 1 on this roster. There was obviously Tucker Kraft was working his way back from injury. There was concern of like when he would be available, and by the time it came around to it, Tucker Kraft was available, and these roles flipped completely. Last season he was not viable at all. His highest scoring game was 4.3 points, but he also did miss from week 5 to week 16. When he came back in week 16, a 0, then a 1.4, then a 2.9. So he was not, a part of this offense at all. If we go back then and look at the previous season, it felt like, he's a rookie. So each game that had a positive in it felt like a really big positive. And then he had a 10.9 point game and a 14-point game. But when we compare that then to what Tucker Kraft did last year, and Kraft is, you have to go back and kind of remember it got a little bit disappointing as the season in certain points. But once the two kind of happened at a very similar time, where I mentioned there the injury for Musgrave. But in week 4, Kraft had 19.3, then 24.8 in week 5, had a 12-point game, then a 16.8-point game. And it was like quiet in between that, and then had 13 and 13 in week 13 and 14. But when it felt like, this was about to just take off when you got to week 5 and you had the 2 back-to-back weeks, and then you had a down week in week 6, 2 back-to-back weeks in week 7 and 8, where you felt like, oh, it's ready to go again. And the one thing that was good is, like, throughout the course of last season, he had 6 tight end 1 games, and this is Tucker Kraft I'm talking about. But there was the other games where they were, sub 10 points, the majority of the other games outside of that. So that became disappointing. And the other part to remember is the Packers weren't passing at the rate that we would have hoped, because Josh Jacobs was doing so well.
Mm-hmm.
So when you factor in like total touchdowns for last season, this is Tucker Kraft. He was 4th in total touchdowns. He was 3rd in fantasy points over expectation per game. Receiving yards, he was 7th. Targets, he was 18th. Receptions, he was 18th. So what he was then doing with them was very beneficial, but it wasn't at the rate. So there's a couple of reasons I'm mentioning what Kraft did here. He could come back this season and it could be all the Tucker Kraft show. It could also be split out. But when we go back and look, it didn't feel like at the end of the prior season, but he finished the prior season pretty strong as well. And that was because Musgrave was out. Musgrave came back then, had the game in the playoffs, which kind of put people back on Musgrave. Like, once he was, this was my thing last year. Once Musgrave was available, it was Musgrave. When Musgrave wasn't available, Tucker Kraft took off in both situations. After saying all that, I think Tucker Kraft's the clear wide tight end 1 on the roster. And I also think that Luke Musgrave is going to find it hard to be a big impact. But again, what you want to do is what could happen. And I can tell myself that picture where Luke Musgrave is keyed into the Packers offense. If something either happens performance-wise or injury-wise to Kraft, I think it's going to be hard for the two of them to coincide together. But when we look at the list, the next one I wanted to mention is somebody who's in that situation unless he gets traded. There has been reports of potential trades, but that was Michael Mayer of the Raiders. I've mentioned this a few times to you. I think that the Raiders will be better off playing 2 tight end sets and having both of those guys, because I think if you go through all the tight ends in the NFL, I think he's probably in the top 20 of them from a talent and athletic perspective. But the problem is Brock Bowers was drafted 1 year after him, which has phased him kind of out of the offense. I think that he is more interesting than Luke Musgrave. And I also think he's interesting if he got traded. Would be a way more interesting. But the tricky thing here is you're kind of looking at 2 players that don't have standalone value, but could have a lot of value. And that's what all these tight ends in this zone kind of look like. Sinat is running that kind of exact replica of the Trey McBride career arc, where he's stuck behind Zach Ertz. And maybe, we get to week 6 this year and Sinat can start to break out, but didn't show a lot, obviously, in the rookie season. I think we know what we have with Will Dissly, and it's not going to get you excited. Conklin has shown some plays at times, but I think I would, again, be looking at Mayer or Musgrave if you had to, particularly in tight end premium. I think then you do factor in Conklin, who has gone a couple of rounds earlier than those guys. And I wouldn't give up completely on the Sinnott story that I was telling myself. Rookie-wise, I'm not as excited about the rookie tight ends this late. I think you want to have them drafted in the early portion with the kind of higher drafted tight ends and avoid some of these guys at the end. But again, as we talk through the tight ends, the wide receivers, the running backs, it becomes clear again that at this part, I think, if you're looking at the last 2 rounds, hitting 2 of these running backs is probably the preferred strategy as we move forward. If you want to take a risk on Michael Mayer getting traded and increasing in value, that's the way you could do it. But I think the other guys are it's hard to say safe plays, but they're the plays that I would be making.
Yeah, and like you said, we are talking tight end premium, so even more so maybe than the wide receivers or running backs. Really, you're looking at a thin field here at the end of the drafts. And then what's even thinner is we're talking quarterbacks. Really, the only guys viable in the late rounds: Jameis Winston, Will Levis, Kenny Pickett, Jalen Milroe. Just real quick, to any of those guys, are there any of those guys would be guys that you would consider, or you just want your quarterbacks locked up by the time you get to round 18, 19?
Winston, when he's a starter in the NFL, is always pretty like fantasy gold. It's kind of, if you don't care about if the team wins or loses and you just want to, get points on the board, he's a great player to have in there. But I think, we've seen over the course of the last couple of times he's been involved that teams don't necessarily want him to be the starter for a whole season. He might come in for a couple of games here or there. And I think that, again, you want to not have that zero in the lineup throughout the course of the majority of the season. So again, I think you want to have your quarterbacks at this point. I'm not excited really about all three of them, mainly on the Winston point because of what I've said there. And then Milroe, again, I think I'm just looking at setting up my board. I've talked with Sean on OT for a long time about drafting from back to front and getting your ADP for your draft up in front of you and like working out if you take if you skip quarterback there and you have to get him in the last round, what does your team look like, and putting all those pieces together. And realistically, it's going to be quite unusual that I'm not setting up my board that these last two rounds are going to be running backs. It's going to be a case where I'm going to try and have the other parts done. And that means then you have to bypass running back, in round 2, round 3, maybe to build out that roster. But that's the way I'm going to tend to do. It's going to be the last 2 rounds. I'm going to be focused on the running backs.
Yeah, and I'm with you there, especially within the cases of Pickett and Levis. I mean, even if you are drafting those guys, there's so much emphasis on quarterbacks and super flex, but there's a good chance you're probably going to have a running back or wide receiver, even a tight end that's going to score more points than them. So, I mean, especially those guys, especially Pickett might get a little steam now that he's really the only quarterback on the Browns roster, but I think it's a total trap play even if he does start. I mean, there's probably going to be wide receivers or running backs that pass him up. So
I thought you were going to say the Browns should start wide receiver, running backs, at quarterback instead.
It wouldn't make much difference. So that'll do it for us today. Thank you, Colm, for jumping on here with me. Like I said at the top of the show, for new users at the FFPC, if you want $25 off of your first team, use the code 25 RotoViz. That's 25 RotoViz when you're signing up. And just jump in and say most fun format that there is out there right now. So we're looking to see you in a draft sometime soon. Could be a listener league. If you're interested in that, please just head over to rotovizradio@gmail.com. Send Colm an email, and we'll be hopefully doing that in the next few weeks, next month or so. Nothing further from me. Is there anything else you want to throw out there, Colm?
No, I think we talked about the rookie running backs and that at the end there or throughout the show. I did do a series with Matt Hicks and Sean Siegel where we talked about the different position groups. By the time you're listening to this, there might be a few of them posted. The running backs went up on Monday. The wide receivers is going to go up on Wednesday, and then we'll have the quarterbacks, tight ends on Friday. So make sure you are subscribed and get those as well. But that's all that I have to plug here at the end of the show.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Colm. So for Colm, I'm Kevin Szafraniec, and we'll see you all next time.